For over 44 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we want to examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is Build Situation Room. And we're once again starting with the battle for Pokrovsk, where Russia has captured around 85% of the city so far, according to our information. We'll take a closer look at this on the map in a moment, but first, let's start with the video footage released by the GUR, Ukraine's military intelligence agency. This footage shows us a very small part of the counterattacks currently being carried out by Ukraine coming from the north, specifically from the direction of Rodinske and Hryshne, two neighboring towns that remain under Ukrainian control. We see this one building here, and essentially the entire video we're about to see, although it's very well edited, actually revolves entirely around helicopter landings. When it comes to artillery attacks, drone strikes, the whole video is really just focused on this one building, and that's exactly what it shows us. Just how incredibly difficult it really is to recapture this city. Here, a quick note for context. We're located, as mentioned, in the northwest of Pokrovsk. Here's a gas station, one I've actually been to before. And here's the city entrance symbol, this large steel structure placed exactly where we from Build have already spoken about and also visited to clearly show the current situation in Pokrovsk as it stands today. The last time I was there was in September last year. Now, as you can clearly see, it's truly become a raging, blazing inferno, where the Russians, as clearly seen in these images, have advanced all the way into the far northwest of Pokrovsk. We keep seeing footage now of how GUR Chief Budanov and probably also the country's defense minister are together planning this attack, planning this small counteroffensive. However, and now we're seeing here the helicopters approaching with the GUR agents inside about to be deployed. Still, once again, it's really just about a small number of buildings, two or three houses. We've seen it here once again. It's pixelated, but you can still see it quite clearly. It's the same gas station we've just seen, so once again, the very same location we've just viewed in the recent drone footage from the Ukrainian defenders. We're now watching the soldiers being deployed. We've already seen this 2 days ago. And now this counteroffensive being launched here, a real and determined counteroffensive, perhaps involving around 11 to 20 Ukrainian soldiers in total. That's being launched here. And if you look at the whole situation, allegedly a T-80 that was captured. Allegedly, it's not entirely clear when from the Russian invaders. The whole thing keeps revolving around the same buildings. That means the Ukrainians are trying to establish some kind of bridgehead in the far northwestern part of the city in order to gain a foothold again, to get back into the city, and from there possibly liberate more streets. And this cycle just repeats itself over and over. It's always the same building, the exact same spot. Everything situated between the gas station and the first industrial structure held by Russian forces here. Clearly, otherwise it wouldn't be attacked here. And this whole situation shows us just how incredibly difficult it is, how much manpower you need, how much firepower you need, just to regain even the first few meters back into Pokrovsk. And this sadly shows us too that the Ukrainian government and the general staff were indeed overly optimistic in their public assessments. When they said the fighting continues in Pokrovsk, we're everywhere there, we're trying to counterattack, there are just isolated Russian soldiers. No, we can see that here the reality is the Russian army has advanced as far as the extreme northwestern part of the city. In the northeast, it's different. Part of the city, including the center, remains under Ukrainian control. We'll take a look at that on the map now. So far, there are no images from Russians, nor any footage of fighting. That's why I assume the fighting is still ongoing here. Although, as I said, the whole situation continues to be extremely difficult. And now we're heading in there. First, let's take a closer look at the situation up close. Hryshne, which I just mentioned, and Rodinske, yes, both under Ukrainian control. And all the fighting we've just seen, the entire attack we witnessed was focused on one house, or 2 or 3 houses here, in this small corner. And here we can clearly see, depicted in a very realistic way, the Russian forces. Orange indicates presence, red indicates solid control. The Russians had actually managed to push forward, at least up until 3 days ago, well beyond the area of Pokrovsk, advancing steadily in a northwesterly direction toward Hryshne, but have since been forced to retreat from that area. And we can assume, at least that's how it appeared at the time, that a very small bridgehead was established near that part of Pokrovsk, precisely because the Russians couldn't manage it alone. In the direction, we can clearly see this advancing toward the Dnipropetrovsk oblast, or indeed along the road, steadily continuing to push further forward with sustained momentum. That means, essentially on their own, in order to limit the Russian advance beyond Pokrovsk here, they've tried to stop them at this point. And apparently they've managed to establish a foothold here. However, this map here is only up to yesterday's date. That means we've also got some further advances by the Russian army. We've got a completely new situation again, where even this last district still held by the Ukrainians, that is this Horos district here in the northeastern part of the city, the Russians have now reached here at least. There are recordings showing them entering this district. We believe that resistance in this area is still continuing. The map is still, as I said, only a day or two old, from November 3rd, I believe. Currently, 85% of the city is under Russian control, and now we're heading to Myrnohrad, since we're always so focused on Pokrovsk, understandably. It's a little bit larger, and the fighting here is even more intense. In Myrnohrad, on the other hand, the current situation on the ground is that, according to our information, up to 8,000 soldiers are holding both the city and especially the southern suburbs here. In Lysivka, for example, down here. And toward Myrnohrad, there are a lot of Ukrainian soldiers sitting in those positions. Various fortifications have also been built here, really deep. Defenses within the fields. But even in Myrnohrad itself, we have the situation where several thousand Ukrainian soldiers are holding this city. And they tell us in the conversations we're able to have with them that they're genuinely afraid to leave their position, because they say that once the evacuation process begins, the officially designated evacuation route would inevitably lead in a northwesterly direction. We'd be putting ourselves in deadly danger, so we'd rather stay in our positions because it's simply safer. Nevertheless, in Myrnohrad, the Russians are continuing to push forward. We've marked this particular area here in orange, and the video we're about to watch was recorded further down south in the region of Myrnohrad. And it shows us exactly how the Russian army is continuing to advance here. Let's take a closer look now. Russian army footage clearly identifiable by the logo shown in the top right area. And first of all, we've seen the entrance to Myrnohrad here. This one right here, featuring a small bunker and also displaying the town's emblem of Myrnohrad on it. And the Russians are cutting this quite cleverly now. You get the impression they're already in the city center, advancing with armored vehicles. This whole thing is most likely propaganda. Let's take a brief moment to look at it. Here we can clearly see a large building standing in place. Here we also see an armored vehicle. However, this vehicle is driving in the center of Myrnohrad. And then we can clearly see the Russian soldiers at the edge of Myrnohrad. So it's not entirely clear who these vehicles actually belong to. We can also see, let's pause it briefly again, we see this vehicle coming to a stop right here. Now we don't see any soldiers getting out, which is why it's possible that the Russians are filming Ukrainian vehicles here or carrying out recordings in other locations as well. And now, in the very next clip right here, we actually see Russian soldiers filming as they go from house to house. In the south of Myrnohrad, right where we just marked the impact location, that's where they're trying to move in and occupy the houses. This clearly shows that in the southern part of Myrnohrad, there's still ongoing resistance and active fighting. We can see that the Russians have only advanced into very few areas there, but then again, they don't really need to push forward any further. If they manage to fully capture Pokrovsk and close the ring north of it. Toward Rodinske, they'd essentially have several thousand soldiers in Myrnohrad trapped inside this pocket and could then simply wait accordingly. Until a formal surrender is eventually negotiated here through political channels, just as it was back then, for example, in Mariupol, or until the soldiers simply surrender on their own because they're just so poorly supplied. Let's take another look at this on the map, this time from a broader perspective, so we can clearly see just how critical the situation actually is. What I already mentioned before is that the Ukrainian forces currently holding positions in Myrnohrad and just south of the town would need to cover a distance of roughly 13 kilometers from that southern point. From up here, it's approximately 5 kilometers through Ukrainian-held territory, an area that remains heavily monitored on both sides by Russian kamikaze drones. We'd have to get through there in order to reach safety towards Hryshyn or Rodinsky. That's extremely dangerous. That's why Ukrainian soldiers tell us we'd better stay right here in position. Either they manage to make their way through to us and succeed in stabilizing the situation again from the Ukrainian side, or at some point will be captured by the Russians. And how crucial the battle for Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad is, we can also see from the fact that Ukraine is now using its air force to target individual destroyed buildings that had been occupied by Russians to attack. We can see one of these buildings here quite clearly, actually, and located very close by are those extensive trench systems that appear to have been captured by the Russians. Here's a building where, according to Ukrainian sources, the Russians have taken shelter. And right now we can clearly see a French-made AASM 250 glide bomb as it impacts right here, striking this target directly, where the Russians had just taken cover. And this was apparently carried out by a Ukrainian Air Force MiG-29 that was operating here. At least it's the same channel that consistently puts out this kind of material and always insists it has close connections to the Air Force based on their claims. You can certainly believe that, since videos keep being released over and over again, consistently showing these MiG-29s here clearly dropping either French bombs of the type just mentioned or GBU-62 bombs from the USA. From Donetsk, we head to Dnipro, to the neighboring region, a bit more centrally located. And here we have yet another video that clearly shows the Russians' latest failed attempt to push forward in this area with armored vehicles, once again highlighting their struggles. Let's first take a look at the video and see that there are a total of 4 tanks and armored fighting vehicles from the Russian army that attempted to make their way across a small river in this particular area here, namely the Vovcha, by driving straight through. Here we can clearly see them 1, 2, 3, 4. that have ended up stranded there, so to speak, or even completely sunk, if we're being very precise indeed. Some Ukrainians say they simply underestimated the river here and got stuck there. Others say no, they drove onto mines that had been placed there, effectively dropped by drones, to make this river crossing extremely difficult and dangerous under the circumstances. Also interesting, these vehicles filmed from the north were all attempting to move northward in the direction of that drone. What we're seeing here is a Ukrainian vehicle that had attempted some time ago to cross through the Vovcha River heading south and was stopped at the very same location by Russian drones. Accordingly, let's keep things moving and take a closer look at how this very attack, which was halted here, we can clearly see it, is a T-72 that's become stuck in the water, and attacks are increasing. Those were BTR-82s as a fairly modern APC. Repeated attacks on the stranded vehicles continue just to make absolutely sure they can't move forward from there. This whole thing is a real disaster for the Russians who've faced this before. At a river crossing, meaning they're just not making progress. And now we can see how these 4 vehicles, which we keep seeing, are being attacked from different directions. Up here again, easy to recognize, it's the old Ukrainian vehicle, has nothing to do with it. And they're attacked from various different directions, and ultimately it's ensured that they're completely destroyed and can't be recovered. Here we can see it once more from a little farther away. Yes, this entire area used to be a kind of riverbed that ran continuously from east to west across the landscape. The Russians had identified this shallow spot to cross. However, as we can see in the end, the whole thing failed badly and led to the Russians losing yet again 4 tanks and infantry fighting vehicles in the Vovcha. We'll take a closer look at the map to understand exactly why the Russians attempted to cross the Vovcha at this particular location. We're currently in the area of Novopavlivka. Novopavlivka, a key location in Dnipropetrovsk, important for defending the eastern direction towards Donetsk, which lies behind this dotted line, as well as the defense toward Dnipropetrovsk, which we can clearly see located down here on the lower side of the map. And we can see quite clearly that the Vovcha here, as we've marked in several places, moves exactly along the oblast border. That means the river is exactly the natural boundary line where the 2 regions were divided from one another. Down here, the Vovcha comes in somewhat from the south and continues on here. We can see that quite clearly here. And what the Russians tried to do was to cross from Yalta to Filia. In Filia, as we can clearly see just from the color, there's already an established Russian presence, but still no Russian vehicles present yet. So far, it's only been infantry troops moving in. They're now attempting to attack Novopavlivka from the southern direction via Filia. That's why there was an attempt here to cross the Vovcha near Yalta, but it failed miserably. We've clearly seen it. Russia lost 4 tanks and armored vehicles in the failed attempt to cross the Vovcha River, collapsing under heavy resistance. Next, we'll take a look at footage from a secret location in eastern Ukraine, a place that once again shows us what the front lines look like at certain positions nowadays. How these fortifications are built, these underground bunkers, in order to stop and fight the Russians from there. We see here, as I mentioned, a bunker located underground from which mortars are fired, relatively large caliber mortars which are being fired here at the Russians, or rather various mortars. And this also clearly shows just how powerful these specific structures are that Ukraine has built up by now. Where the front line is relatively stable, you can do that. You can basically hide underground. Here, a Russian kamikaze drone seems to have crashed, or a battery is burning, or something like that. In any case, all of this gives us a bit of an insight into the soldier's life in this position, most of it underground. We'll also see it again from different angles shortly, showing just how deeply embedded this whole setup really is. Here we can see it. This is at least 2 or 3 meters deep, where the Ukrainians are living underground. You can clearly see it here, the mortar being fired from this exact position, specially built so you can watch safely from the side or simply place your phone down to record the action, to film everything. And we keep seeing these very specific construction measures made from tree trunks sometimes also, from concrete, which have clearly been set up here. And we see it again and again. The Ukrainians quickly rush out, open fire, then immediately retreat back into their position to keep holding this extensive underground fortress that has been constructed and reinforced down here. It's quite interesting to see how these defensive lines are set up and where they can be deployed. However, we often have the situation where these defensive lines get overrun, and then the Ukrainians have to set up or find completely new positions that were built further back, which makes things difficult. As I said, this here shows us one of those mortar fortifications that was set up, most likely in the vicinity of Toretsk, I'd say, based on the unit involved, in order to defend this particular area here effectively. Next, we'll take a look at the Ukrainian hunt for a relatively new, larger Russian kamikaze drone, the so-called BM-35. And this is indeed a drone that's only been on the market for a few weeks, so to speak, or rather has only been deployed by the Russian army for a few weeks. And now we can see quite clearly that the Ukrainians are hunting it with their interceptor, meaning interception drones. And these drones look a bit, well, just a bit. You have to catch the right moment, similar to the Shaheds. We can clearly see that it's a delta-wing aircraft featuring a central propeller. The thing is, though, these drones are smaller. That means they don't have a range of 800 kilometers, but only about 50 kilometers. And they can actually be deployed for various purposes, including reconnaissance, kamikaze missions, or as decoy drones. That's, of course, quite a broad range of different options the Russians have when deploying them in various scenarios. That's why so many of them are being built and also deployed. But we see it. The Ukrainians have managed to crack these signals, so to speak, and based on the radar signatures to target and hunt them quite precisely. And here we see roughly, I think we have some kind of counter in the corner, yes, showing that by the end, 20 or even more of them will be brought down from the sky. We also see that OPSEC matters increasingly more to Ukrainians now. Earlier, we could still clearly spot where they were operating. That means we could clearly see the surroundings. Now, of course, the Ukrainians are actively trying to blur or pixelate the background as much as possible, because quite often they're only able to intercept it over their own territory, meaning they first need to position themselves above their own positions. And that means, of course, that they would then use their attack footage on these BM-35s to clearly reveal the exact locations of their own positions. They don't want that, so here, 28 BM-35s taken out of the sky. However, this also shows us just how immense the capabilities Russia's army has now built up. From the front in the east of the country, we now move to Crimea. Here, too, Ukraine remains highly active in targeting high-value military assets. We have here, once again, the GUR, meaning Ukraine's military intelligence agency, targeting S-400 systems on Crimea. These are the most powerful, the strongest air defense systems that Russia has. But even these systems, as we see here, are completely useless and also blind to small Ukrainian drones that, as we see here, attack these systems, targeting the control centers as well. And we're about to see right now how this S-400 system here catches fire, once again costing tens of millions of euros. Burned up funds the Russian leadership poured into its military, money originating from Gazprom or similar sources, earned through exports to Germany or other regions here. Here we see the big fire that broke out. Ultimately, the Ukrainians managed to destroy the extensive defense system on Crimea, which had been specifically developed for air defense operations, to attack and disable using small kamikaze drones that are able to operate undetected below the S-400 radar system here, maneuvering with high precision at low altitudes. Another video from the outer regions of Crimea will now take a closer look at footage that was captured out in the Black Sea. Here, Ukraine's intelligence service carried out a targeted attack on a mobile platform that originally belonged to Ukraine and had been unlawfully seized by Russian forces back in 2014 during the annexation. And here, the Russians have clearly set up a specialized military unit that has firmly established and maintained a strong presence on this particular offshore drilling platform. And we see the attack from various perspectives. On one hand, we have surveillance drones, of course, filming the whole thing. On the other hand, we see here a first floating drone loaded with explosives approaching the platform right now and then detonating against it. And the interesting thing is, right after that, we also see a carrier drone, a floating type, that deploys a Ukrainian drone from its platform, launching it into action. Now here we can see it. This is the live perspective of a Ukrainian army kamikaze drone, which is now taking off from this floating drone, which is also moving directly toward the platform in the distance. And possibly this drone, even the floating one, could actually be used not only to carry drones, small flying drones, but is also likely packed full of dynamite as well, making it a dual-purpose weapon system to attack this platform here. It's really interesting how the Ukrainians are coordinating all this by now, how they're attacking from different directions. We can now also see the impact here caused by the kamikaze drone successfully managing from various directions to strike these Russian naval units in the Black Sea, in this case a platform, and precisely there to ensure that the Russians can't move freely on these platforms, can't remain active on Ukraine's stolen property, and from there keep launching their own drones toward Kherson and various other nearby regions as well. So launching them toward southern Ukraine. We're now seeing several impacts around precisely highlighting once again this floating drone, this kamikaze drone up here. We can already see it quite clearly. To be precise, these are the Russians firing from there at least 3 soldiers. Firing at this swim drone, but we do see in the end, even though the swim drone is moving relatively slowly and might already have sustained some damage, it still successfully makes it to the platform and then explodes right there. Let's just let the video play through to the end so we can see, now we see it, that this other drone approaching from below, in this case from the south, is actually getting closer, heading toward the platform, and ultimately makes it, despite being shot at, possibly with damaged motor, we're not sure, before exploding there, and thus causing even more trouble for the Russians in that area. Finally, let's take a look at a Ukrainian long-range attack from last night. An attack once again targeting the refinery in Kstovo, situated in the Nizhny Novgorod region, just a short distance to the east of Moscow. And here we have eyewitness footage once again showing the refinery was hit and has caught fire. The Kstovo refinery has a refining capacity of approximately around 15 million barrels, if I'm not mistaken. It was attacked earlier in the year, although of course quickly repaired by the Russians, and is therefore now once again back in operation and in the sights of Ukrainian long-range drones. In this case, we don't know what was deployed. There are no videos of the approach. We only see the air defense and then the fire breaking out at the refinery. We can, however, say with absolute certainty exactly where it all took place. We're clearly able to make out the precise location here on the following map, well over, 700 kilometers away from Ukraine. We see it passing Moscow, heading in the direction of Nizhny Novgorod. Kstovo is shown here, which means once again Ukraine manages to get through the entire Russian air defense system, which has already been significantly weakened but still remains largely operational, to strike relatively deep inside Russia and thereby attempt to further intensify this fuel crisis that we've already started to witness, which the Russians were nevertheless able to somewhat reduce by implementing emergency measures, thus further intensifying the ongoing fuel crisis within Russia, so that the Russian population clearly feels its impact, that the war waged by their president against the small neighboring country also has consequences for them.